Shortly after the Spanish conquest of Mexico, one native writer looked back at the history of his country and reflected on its foundational peoples. Of the Toltecs, he stated that nothing was too difficult for them, and no place with which they dealt too distant. And, after their rapid demise, no other people of Mexico could compare to them, not the Maya, the Aztecs, or even the Spanish. Unfortunately, few outside of Mexico, or Mexico, and parts of Central America know much, if anything, about the Toltecs. Hopefully, after this short program, you'll have a better idea of who the Toltecs were and how they've impacted Mexican history. First though, let's define the word Toltec, which can actually be quite broad. The word appears quite frequently in the indigenous chronicles and codices of other Mesoamerican peoples, such as those of the Aztec and the Maya. It's been used to describe a type of art, or simply people who lived in cities. However, for our purposes here, we're going to define Toltec, or the Toltec culture, as that of referring to the people who between the years 900 to 1200 both created and lived in the Mesoamerican state that was centered around the legendary city of Tolan, today believed by most archaeologists to be the site of Tula in central Mexico. As mentioned earlier, much of what we know about the people known as the Toltecs comes from the sources of others, mainly the Aztecs and the Mayans, at least initially. Today, several archaeological sites have been identified as belonging to the Toltec culture, the most famous being their capital, Tolan, aka Tula. Most of what we know about early Toltec history comes from Aztec mythology, much of which was first written down in the 16th century. What follows is the most popular version of events, which goes something like this. Led by their ruler, Mixcoatl, whose name means cloud serpent, the early Toltecs, around the 9th century, entered the areas of central and southwestern Mexico. They settled down at a site called Teotihuacán, where they also founded a city of the same name. For his great deeds, Mixcoatl was later deified and became a patron god of hunting, but his son and heir, Topitzin, would go on to become much more famous and important in the universe of Mesoamerican mythology. Born in the year one read of the Aztec calendar, which for us is either 935 or 947 AD, depending on whose conversion you follow, Topitzin was said to have been fair-skinned with long black hair and a beard. After succeeding his father, Topitzin moved the Toltec capital from Teotihuacán to Tolan. However, a few years later, crisis struck the city. On one side was Topitzin, who by then was sort of a priest king dedicated to the peaceful cult of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, which forbade human sacrifice and basically believed in the upliftment of mankind. In fact, for many, Topitzin and Quetzalcoatl were believed to be one and the same. Regardless, Quetzalcoatl would go on to become one of the most popular gods in all of ancient Mesoamerica. On the other side were the devotees of the powerful god Tezcatlipoca, whose name means smoking mirror, and is the lord of night, the patron of sorcerers, and later on, also warriors. Unlike those of Quetzalcoatl, his followers practiced human sacrifice. Due to this power struggle, which historically may have been between two opposing Toltec factions, one pacifist and the other militant, Topitzin and his followers were eventually forced to flee Tolan. One Nahuatl language poem describes Topitzin's anguish as he leaves his beloved city. Then he fixes his eyes on Tula, and in that moment begins to weep. As he weeps sobbing, it is like two torrents of hail trickling down. His tears slip down his face. His tears, drop by drop, perforate the stones. Eventually, Topitzin makes it to the Gulf of Mexico, where according to one version of the story, he sets himself on fire. However, another, more famous version claims that he set off with a group of his followers on a raft and journeyed to the east, from where he would one day return. When the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived on the eastern shores of the Gulf of Mexico in February of 1519, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma II believed that this light-skinned, bearded Spaniard, who had literally arrived on a mysterious boat and with a band of followers from the east, was the returning Topitzin, the god Quetzalcoatl himself. With Tezcatlipoca's followers ruling over Tulan, the Toltec Empire is said to have reached the peak of its prosperity and territorial expansion. In Tulan, the palaces were said to be made of gold and jade, the ears of maize grown on its farms as large as giant stones, and the city's Toltec artisans created some of the most beautiful objects out of precious stones, metals, and obsidian. In the literature of Mexico and Central America, Tulan is described as an earthly paradise. The city's prosperity, though, didn't last. By the reign of its last king, Olmec, whose name means big hand, Tulan was besieged by severe droughts and factionalism, and eventually, Toltec society broke down. Perhaps due to the strife, Olmec transferred the capital of the Toltec nation to Chapultepec, today in the western part of Mexico City, where, in despair, he committed suicide. Within 15 years, Tulan was completely abandoned and left to ruin. One poem describes it as such. Everywhere there meet the eye, everywhere can be seen the remains of clay vessels, of their cups, their figures, of their dolls, of their figurines, of their bracelets. Everywhere are their ruins. Truly, the Toltecs once lived there. And thus began the great Toltec diaspora into all regions of Mexico, Guatemala, and beyond. It's from these people who the great kings of the Maya, the Aztecs, and others all claimed their descent. The site that today is believed by most Mesoamerican archaeologists to have been the great city of Tulan is that of Tula, in the Mexican state of Hidalgo, just northwest of Mexico City. It also appears that rather than simply being abandoned, the city was deliberately set on fire. Not only this, but the later Aztecs, who claim to have venerated the site and the civilization to which it once belonged, thoroughly looted it of its treasures, many of which were taken to their capital city of Tenochtitlan. Despite this, the ruins of Tula are still quite impressive and contain remnants of several pyramids, colossal stone statues, bas-reliefs of soldiers, animals, gods, and daily life, as well as plenty of other interesting artifacts that have been uncovered and are currently displayed at the local museum and archaeological park. After the fall of the great city of Teotihuacán around the 7th or 8th century, which we covered in a past program, and which I'll link to in the video description, Tulan was the first state to integrate large areas of Mexico and parts of Central America into a single political and cultural system. It's hard to say just how much actual control the rulers of Tulan had over the surrounding areas, and also nearly impossible to draw precise borders. Based on archaeological findings and indigenous chronicles, it appears that Tula controlled much of central Mexico, along with some parts of the Gulf Coast, the Yucatan, and other areas to the west. However, the city's cultural and religious impact is better understood. The influence of Toltec culture can be seen in places as far away as Costa Rica to the south, all the way north to the states of Arizona and New Mexico in the USA. Between the 10th and 12th centuries, Tula was one of the largest cities in Mesoamerica, with an estimated population of between 30 to 40,000 people. As far as we can tell, it was ruled by several kings who seemed to have strengthened their state through alliances with other nearby peoples. One common way of doing this was through marriage. These marriages were important, and, along with cementing the king of Tula's hold on an area, were a source of prestige for the new client state or kingdom. For example, Acamapichtli, the first Aztec king of Tenochtitlan, was chosen by his people specifically because he had Toltec blood from the royal dynasty of Culhuacan. Supporting the kings were warriors who were divided into orders that represented various animals or deities. Wearing colorful headdresses, Toltec warriors were adorned with chestplates and padded armor, and generally carried a short sword, a club, darts, and a small shield. Tula was close to sources of obsidian, which was fashioned into all sorts of objects such as tools, knives, arrowheads, jewelry, and ornaments, which were then traded with the surrounding peoples. In return for this, and local crops such as maize and cotton, the people of Tula imported a whole host of goods from other areas of Mesoamerica. Excavations in numerous parts of Tula, not just palaces or elite residences, but those whom archaeologists can only conclude to have been common people, have uncovered ceramics known as Nicoya polychrome, which is known to have come from as far away as Nicaragua and Costa Rica. But that's just one end of the spectrum. There have been tiny plaques of turquoise, presumably from New Mexico or perhaps Arizona, that have also been found in Tula. All of this seems to suggest, especially since such items were found in the homes of commoners, that the Toltec state's trade and tribute systems were both expansive and complex. Most of these objects would have been brought to the city by traders and merchants. As for luxury items, several objects made of gold have also been discovered in and around Tula. Based on the interpretation of indigenous chronicles as well as archaeology, it appears that the expansion of Toltec culture between the 9th and 12th centuries brought about many changes in the religious beliefs of the people of Mesoamerica. As we saw earlier, the story about the founding of Tolan, Topitzin, Quetzalcoatl, and his rival, Tezcatlipoca, are not just part of Toltec mythology, but also that of the Aztecs and Maya. In addition to these, the Toltecs likely introduced other deities into the holy pantheon of Mesoamerica, as well as several myths that became part of the popular religion of the region. So, I hope that you now have a better idea of who the Toltecs were and why they're important to the history of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. As always, thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate it. I'd also really like to thank GrandKek69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Danielle Allen, Denny Van Ecke, WineXTV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Faridun Dadachanji, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.